All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody, to the session on cost increases and what the hell do we do now? That's the subtitle. They didn't put that subtitle in there. I'm Brian Lloyd. I'm with Beacon Development Group. I'm going to moderate this, but the heavy lifting is going to be done by our panelists here. So let me introduce them to you. Shawn Scott with Rafn Construction. A great partner to many of us doing affordable housing projects in the Seattle-King County area and beyond. JJ Powell, project manager with Walsh Construction, another great contractor partner. So we've got two experts from the contractor side. And Allison Lorig, senior vice president with Bridge Housing. Allison has been in development for, I was going to say a long time. Maybe you don't want me to say that. She's very knowledgeable. How do you say that without saying you've been, yeah, Allison knows her stuff. And then Emily Thompson, partner with GMD. They're a developer doing affordable and market rate housing, multifamily development. Washington, Idaho, Montana. So a lot of experience up here, both the contractor side and the developer side. So we're going to try to tackle this question that is, I think, more immediate than it has ever been since I've been in development. Cost increases are just incredible right now. So in this climate, we want to talk through what are the drivers and what are the things that we can be doing as development teams, as ownership, to mitigate the impacts on the projects. They don't have half price sales for lumber or windows. And so we just have to deal with it. But how can we be smart and deal with that effectively? That's what we want to try to get at today. So let's start with each of our panelists anecdotally talking about things that they've seen as key differences between projects that they're doing now and projects that they worked on 2 or 3 years ago to sort of set the stage. So I'll just go down the line. Shawn, you want to go first?
Sure. That's really loud. Yeah, so really what we're seeing is the importance of pre-construction and bringing on certain knowledge-based experts very, very early in the process. Specifically MEP subs. We used to bring them on, further into design development as you were approaching permit, but now it's absolutely necessary to get them involved as a member of the design team at schematic design.
I forgot to say something, Shawn.
Yeah.
We would like you to ask questions as we go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I know someone out there is saying, what is MEP? Did someone have that question? So I'll ask it for you. But in the future, you are responsible to ask your own questions. So please just raise your hand and ask questions as we go. That'll make this more interesting. So Shawn, what the hell does MEP stand for?
Mechanical, electrical, plumbing. So the guts of your building. A lot of this is being driven by energy code, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as we get into this. But the days of designing a beautiful box and then shoving everything inside of it without worrying about the design impacts of that are long gone. So really having everybody involved early on. What that means, though, is that, as you know, a lot of these projects are in development for quite a while before they break ground. So you have increased costs for pre-construction. You are committing money to the design of those components of your building, which creates some funding hurdles for some people, I understand, and I think that'll get mentioned further down the line here. So that's the biggest difference for us, and it's an absolute essential.
Was there a question? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. So I would say, in my experience, we've always planned for robust systems. When we're working in the affordable housing arena, we're operating with the end in mind, which is low maintenance, long lasting. A lot of these developments don't have operating budgets to have a full-time maintenance staff. They're spread pretty thin. So historically speaking, I think we've done a good job of planning for that already, but the new energy code has caused everybody to operate with a little bit greater efficiency in mind. So routing of all the plumbing pipes, they're just smarter about that in the way that the energy is being used and the access for those for turning off at each unit, sub-metering and all of that. So does that answer your question?
Did you, how about you? What are you seeing different now than a couple years ago?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? One of the things that has come into view is kind of early procurement issues, kind of going along with what Shawn was talking about, front loading your pre-construction, really being aware, eyes wide open about some of those procurement of either materials, subcontractors, during pre-construction. A good example would be a project that's in construction for us right now. We ordered electrical gear specific to our project. So it's engineered by the manufacturer to be, specific to our project. And it was ordered in July of 2021. And so we've experienced some delays on that. And, there's a production issue in Mexico. And we would have thought if we would have ordered in July of 21, 3 months before we started construction, that we would have had that gear, right when we were told we would have it. It's going to take 18 months overall. So we'll have it in December, which is just in the nick of time. But, items like that, it's a pretty big piece of the puzzle in terms of the budget, but also, risk and equipment. So, thinking creatively with the whole team about, some of those items that maybe need to be planned for ahead of construction even. That's kind of something that we've seen creep into the conversation.
Great, thanks you. Allison, how about you?
I think one of the biggest changes in the last 2 years is working with our contractors who have done a lot of work in affordable housing or just multifamily in general. The contingencies and the escalations were pretty well known. So I think when we got a budget bust at bid, we were really close to, okay, we've got a 4%, 5% increase. We need to get that out. We can do our VE. We just had a situation where we've closed on a project as of last week. We got pricing in, it was over price. We VE'd 9% so that we only had a 2% increase over our last bid. And this is sort of first bid in February. And I think that's really the first time in quite a long time where you're seeing all these increases, and you're having to do significant cuts if you have to actually get back down to that original number. And that's a little scary.
I think what we're seeing in the major difference is these projects can take 2 to 4 years from when you start working on them and designing them to when you close. And it used to be that we could have, as a developer, an escalation clause of 3 to 5% per year, and that would cumulatively carry you forward, so you would have a budget at closing that you could get closed on, and that no longer works. And so it's rethinking the strategy points at which you can talk to your contractor about what your pricing is going to be, and really thinking honestly with yourself about what you think the cost of the project is going to be, which is challenging because we have public funders that want to see us have cost containment and incentivize cost containment. And so you are incentivized to have the lowest number that you think you can build the building for on your application, but that may not be enough to get you to the finish line. And for example, the week before last, Housing Trust Fund announced they're going to fund $26.2 million to 22 projects, gap funding, mostly to get them closed because construction prices have gone up. And that's not the fault of the applicants. It's the reality of this current situation being very, very different from years past.
Yeah, so have we ever done that before? Have we ever seen projects having gaps after funding in the same scale that we have now? I don't remember it. So definitely we're in a unique situation. All right, so we laid a little bit of groundwork there. Let's dig into some of these ideas a little bit more deeply. And again, you have to ask questions. I told my panel yesterday that you can't leave if you don't ask questions. So that's a lot of questions. So you better get on it. All right, so let's dig into these principles a little bit. JJ, this question is for you. So talk more about how a team can prepare for a project that we know are going to face these challenges. How can a team plan for the challenges up front?
Yeah, kind of going back to that integration piece up front, early and often. Some of us, I'm going to bring up that phrase again, MEP, where we've become used to seeing mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, sometimes elevator manufacturer, involved in projects much sooner. Again, thinking about that early procurement piece, maybe there's a component of it that's sort of qualitative, but also quantitative, holding their budget as we go along, accounting for changes. But it's really important for all the reasons that Shawn mentioned and so many more to bring them along and have that key sub and key trade input. And frankly, whether you're working with consultants, on the design side, or whether you're working with trade design build teams, it's super important to bring them into that, to the table and iterate your design with them. Getting back to the conversation about where are the pipes routed? How do we access things? Integrating them with maybe your facilities folks, getting some input from your key stakeholders and how they need this building to be arranged and really partnering with the entire design team. So integration and engagement early on is really important. We've seen some success in bringing in others, framing subs, for example, bringing a wood framer in and pairing them with the engineer of record and, not necessarily designing the entire box, as you put it, and then just putting it out there and figuring out where the holes are afterward, but really getting the framers' feedback on how that's going to work. How is that building? How are all those components going to go together? Is it feasible? Is it buildable? And then iterating that back to the engineers, to the architect, and working on that design together. All the while, involving our estimating department and tracking costs, tracking ups and downs, and making smart decisions as we can.
It sounds complicated and labor intensive, which means expensive, right? So how do you justify that type of cost? That's a new type of cost that owners are having to deal with.
Yeah, I think
why is it worth it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, it gets back to what Shawn was saying, which is, potentially front loading your project and planning for advanced costs, that lead to savings down the road. A good example is a project that we closed out last year, Fellow Park. Some of you might have heard about it. We saw savings, throughout the estimating project, of the project, but then we're able to share savings back with the owner. And that was a good example of a project where, we had concrete, we had elevator, wood framer, metal framer, drywall. We had key subcontractors and key trades involved as a sort of a design assist to help the engineers validate their designs, reducing unknowns, reducing RFIs down the road, reducing potential cost impacts. And we were really able to not only cut down contingency on the project, that was key on the front end, but we were able to cut down the overall cost and the duration of the project as well.
I think you also had a badass project manager on the owner's side who wouldn't take no for an answer.
Indeed.
All right, question over here. Can you put a cost to that, JJ, or anybody have an idea on how to?
Yes. I think it's hundreds of thousands really is what you're looking at. But you're talking about the cost curve shifting, number one. And I know with that, it's easy to say, but it really is. Yeah. I would argue though, that you're also shifting that risk curve a little bit too, not just shifting the risk, forward, you're actually reducing risk. Because you're getting buy-in. You're getting buy-in not just from us, but you're getting buy-in from those trades. And they're on board. I mean, they're the ones that told us they could build it this way, and if they can't, they're out. We got to find somebody else, a better partner. Do you guys want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, I think what JJ is saying about the early buy-in is very true. And I think when I've worked with Walsh for, I don't know, a couple decades now. And when I look at those projects that were most successful, it was because the owner was actually working really closely with the design team and the contractor to really actually understand what the drivers were. Because we're all looking at these performas, we're looking at unknowns and sort of having to put a percentage of how unknown is that number. And what you're trying to do is say, okay, we have as small of a percentage as we can that is truly unknown, knowing that we have some risk factors. But I think in 2007, I had a project where my budget busts were in concrete and drywall. And I can't VE concrete and drywall very easily. So that's what really understanding, like today, what are those drivers? Because when I'm looking at pricing where my appliances are twice as expensive as they used to be because we just can't get them, that's not a cost I can control. And there's sort of the hope that, maybe by the time the buildings needs them, things will rectify a little bit. But I think understanding where these drivers are is really important.
Let me ask Shawn to jump in on this.
Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about, pre-construction success, and I think that's what we're talking about here. So I'm just going to add a little bit more to what JJ was saying, and that, it's our job when we're hired as contractors to minimize the risk of that cost fluctuation. And we're in an arena right now where we are not able to do that. There are things that are out of our control. But the things that we can control are early involvement and early planning and pre-construction. And then you have these outside factors that are energy code related, and those are things that we also can control. The framing example that JJ makes is a really good one. And if there's consultant engineers in the room, I don't want to say anything bad about you guys, but it's one thing for something to really work on paper, but as you're working through the guts of the building and the mechanical systems, and there's just a new reality of the size of the ducts that have to go down every corridor and in and out of every unit. And then you point to the structural engineer and like, oh, how can we get this extra 12 inches of space? And he says, oh, well, we'll do this. We'll use a specific type of car decking and block out an area to allow access for that. And then they say, oh, well, Shawn, JJ, how much does that cost? And then we have to go to a subcontractor and get them involved. But then it comes to constructability, and is it actually attainable? Everything's buildable, but if you need some weird fastener that's really labor intensive and it's going to take you an hour to install 10 lineal feet of this floor joists, that's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. So we want to have that information when that decision is being made, because once the decision is made early on, to frame it that way so that the mechanical system is routed, that mechanical system cannot change later. You're going to get further down the design path. You're going to go in for permit, and then you're going to say, oh, it's going to cost $50,000 per corridor to frame it this way. Let's do the ducting different. And you're married to that mechanical system at that point. So lots of examples of planning early on to make sure that it's buildable. So that's the constructability term that we always kind of throw around. And I know that engineers know what's buildable, but it's really getting into all the nuance of the fasteners, like down to that type of minutia early on, which is something that we never had to do before.
There was, Scott had a question, then I'll come over to here. Yep.
I'm going to forget what the first part was. So I'll take a stab at this from the owner's perspective, because we just started construction on a building that was permitted under the new energy code. So difference in that building than other buildings. We had the energy consultant at the table as part of the team at the very beginning. Usually we bring them in later to provide the reports that we need, or sort of, back check what we already know about meeting our C406 goals. So having them at the table working collaboratively, because this was an early new energy code project, to try to figure out, and this wasn't just go meet with the owner and figure out what the owner wants in the building and then go, the design team goes, like the owner is at the table with the energy consultant, with the MEP, with the GC, with the architect, like with everyone. And that's a little bit different. Usually we're able to push some of that later in the project, having everyone there early and often. And sort of to go back to the question of cost, if everyone is not at the table, you're not getting accurate feedback, and you can't then from an applicant perspective give accurate information to your public funders about the validity of the numbers in your application, and talking to them about what your needs are going to be to actually get closed. And they can't help you if you can't give them information. So early, often more is, I think, the theme of this. That's really what has changed.
Yeah, and I guess I would also add that utilizing the contractor's ability to get put the pricing together, because I do think that energy code changes. There's a lot of pick on the energy code, but it's the unintended consequences, right? So when JJ is talking about the corridor distribution system, and you're looking at reframing that, well, if I want to relieve that pressure and say make the building taller, then I'm getting into obviously more skin, more walls, but I may also be running up against height restrictions. So we're looking at these projects and saying, okay, how do we stay under the requirement for a man lift? Because that's $500,000. How do we shorten up some of these timeframes? And exactly what they're talking about, make it easy so that when you're really starting to spend money on construction, that everybody on the team knows what the target is and can be as efficient as they absolutely can.
Thanks. Can I go to this question over here? That's a whole session right there. So let's come back to that if we have time at the end. I mean, I think those are great, innovative ideas. I don't think we've even approached the tipping point where those are cost savers, but hopefully, you know, as more people try them and work out kinks and there's more production possibilities, we'll get there. But you want to say a word on that?
You know, I wanted to go back real quick to Scott's questions, the specifics of your question, meaning what are the mechanisms to involve sub designers, whether, you know, design build relationship, and what are the sort of the supports required? I think that's where you're going with it. What are the supports required to get them on board? Also the supports required during construction, maybe to review. I think that could also be its own session. Good overachiever, Scott. But I do think, I think that it really depends. I've got two great examples, two very, you know, wonderful projects in the last couple of years. One that did not involve a kind of a performance spec, if you will. Just we brought on, collaboratively interviewed the sub designers.
What does that mean, performance spec?
Oh, thank you. So we did not have a consultant come in. A performance spec might be a specification or a narrative that you write to have to kind of develop the performance requirements and the criteria to hire the appropriate designer and maybe the sub designer.
I think about it like Cliff Notes versus the whole novel.
Yeah.
So you're asking
Pretty much.
someone to write the Cliff Notes
Yep.
to guide the team versus having the whole thing laid out. Yeah.
Yeah, and it gives you kind of an apples to apples comparison, right? So you can say these two MEP design build subs, I can evaluate their proposal based on this performance criteria. So very useful. The project I'm thinking of, again, at Thela Park, we interviewed the subs collaboratively with the design team and the owner. We had those qualifications in mind. We had asked those questions in kind of as part of the RFP. A little looser format, but it was about performance from the get-go in schematic. Another example would be Sider and Byers on a current project had written a performance criteria. We were able to evaluate those subcontractors, bring them on, and they were able to get up to speed right away, like with what Scott was talking about, you know, understanding the owner's requirements. And they were able to really take that on and advocate for the owner's requirements, putting the pipes in the right place. And think about durability, longevity. In terms of assistance and support for later on, you know, through construction, I think that's really up to the team. If the team feels that there's a kind of the need, I think it can be very helpful. I know Sider and Byers also came in, they were the performance spec writer. They also came in as a third-party reviewer. But I will say this, they were very focused on the owner's requirements, code, you know, were we meeting the goals of that original performance spec? Did things deviate? They were very focused on project. They weren't just writing a letter to write a letter. They didn't necessarily hold, you know, they understood that when we deviated as a team, because it wasn't just Walsh and the MEP design build subs, when we made a decision as a team, they understood why we made that decision. You know, why did we go to in-unit ERVs? Why did we go make this decision? Why did we make that decision? And I think that made the process more useful for everybody. It really added value to the process. So.
Great, thanks, JJ. Let's move from the pre-construction part of the project process. Yeah, question before we go on? Couple. Anybody want to comment on that? What are you seeing in comparison with the type 1 and type 3?
I think that that's it's something that's come down the pipeline very recently. I'm working on a project right now that's doing exactly that. 6/2. So doing a lot of cost analysis and study on the benefits of going that way and what it allows you to do from a unit stacking standpoint. You know, have one less level of concrete and structure to kind of coordinate all of your mechanical systems and electrical systems. So I'm seeing it. We're being asked to price it consistently right now in Seattle, in the Seattle market.
Yes.
Katie? Katie, and then there's a question on the left. Katie?
Well, I'll go first here really quick. I'd say, speaking from a Rafn standpoint, this is a part of the conversation early on. It's when we create a project team for a project, we're committed to keeping that team together for that project. And the superintendent's involved from day one in pre-construction, understanding how all of those systems are impacting the building and sequencing and site logistics. Not everybody does it that way. People win jobs and then they take 2 years to go through development and then they break ground and then it's whoever's available at that time. So that's what you're talking about. So all I can say is that from a development standpoint and an owner standpoint, you should have that conversation at the very beginning, knowing what you know.
Well, I think up and down the project team, that's an important conversation. Just how will this project team be configured? And how are we sharing knowledge from pre-construction to construction? Likewise, I think we're very similar companies in our approach. We try to involve, the superintendent's a key member of that pre-construction team. They bring scheduling, sequencing knowledge that, is more complex and maybe more nuanced than what I can bring. And, they certainly have ways that they like doing things. But it is important to involve them in decision-making as well. So to that point, involving your team.
The other question over here. Yeah.
Hold on, let's get our crystal ball. Be right back. No, oops.
So I had notice to proceed and we broke ground on a project February 27th, 2020. And then everything stopped, right? It was affordable housing, so we were essential, we kept going. Starting the project at that time, we didn't have what we have now, which is a whole bunch of contract language that manages risk for everybody involved. So what it forced us to do was to be, it was a project with a good partner. We just put everything out on the table, but it started at the subcontractor level. Everybody was just very transparent, communicated openly and honestly. And I think that's just, it sounds silly, but that's just, it felt really good to communicate that way and be really open and understand that it was a shared experience. It wasn't something that you had to have, you had to put the subcontractor like in a bad spot where they were going to lose money. So I don't think we're out of it, but I think that for me, the lesson was that we got to just experience an entire project, because it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't lumber, it was flooring, it was caulking and painting and appliances and everything. So literally every day I felt like I was calling my owner with bad news, or the architect. That beautiful thing that you like, yeah, we can't get that, but we can get these two things and keep schedule, and it won't impact cost. Or we got a lot of practice in having really difficult conversations. And for me, it just is the way that I want to operate all the time. That's my example. I don't think that there's a lot of reason for optimism, but I think that we can continue to communicate that way.
I would parrot a lot of what you just said, except just to say that emphasis on, I like working this way, at least in terms of the open communication. Some of the ways that we had been communicating with subs and suppliers and seeing more information from them, frankly, has become a bit more of the norm now, for better or worse. And I feel like we're getting more information now. Sometimes you don't want that information, it's coming. But, I think just that open communication, putting it above board, looking at pricing together, lumber hit us right in the middle of Othello Park. Remember that, Robin? And we were reviewing with Brad at Lehigh, we were reviewing invoices from Matthews Lumber, and we were tracking that invoicing. It was a cost plus situation, but we were projecting where we thought it was going to land, watching it. Sometimes things came down. We were high-fiving for a second, but it was I think it did open that conversation sort of up and down the project chain, if you will.
But yeah, so we've kind of shifted from the pre-con part to what do you do when you're trying to start construction?
Well,
So
and that's kind of what I was going to
can we go
piggyback
there?
from the owner's perspective. I think something that's really changed is it used to be you would have your lender or your investor might engage a cost of constructability, but one of them would engage a cost of constructability report and the other one would rely on it. And they would, an engineer would look at your plans and look at your budget and try to decide that you had enough money to build the building that you had designed. And that has really transformed now. They will have a long list of questions for the owner and the contractor, and they are not sending one list of questions to the contractor and one list of questions to the owner. They expect the team to be able to answer, how are you handling allowances? How are you going to handle a situation if there is another concrete strike? What is your intention? What relationships do you have built into these subcontractor relationships? Like, they want the project team to be a lot deeper and prepared for what might come based on the last couple of years of experience. And so that's something that, as an owner, I mean, I'm very involved in my projects. I usually can sort of, answer the softball questions, but they now expect your lenders expect you to be much more versed in this. And so they want to know that you're as a team collaboratively thinking about the allowances and the pricing that it won't be held by the subcontractor and things like that going into closing. So not just you have enough money to build your building. So
I'd also just add on this, from the standpoint of cost stabilizing, I think we're also all looking at what interest rates are doing. So at least from this standpoint, if we say, gosh, maybe in the next 3 months or so, construction costs will settle down, or we'll have a better idea of where we are. I think the next piece is that interest rate, and sort of saying, okay, well, now I have an issue where I can't afford as much as I did. And that's a real piece to look at. And I wanted to also point out, I think when we're going in and designing projects, especially when you have groups that have been doing this for a long time, we used to be able to not cut as deeply when we're thinking about efficiencies. Sometimes we'd go in and we'd say, gosh, no, I really like that detail. I'm going to hold on to it until sort of the very end. And that really impacts your team's ability to keep to the schedule. And if time value of money, we know that it gets more expensive over time. So I think there is, as we're looking at the projects, making sure that we're probably going a little bit further than we're all comfortable with. And then thinking about if there's money left over, we all have to carry contingencies. We all know with the LIHTC program, we got to spend it. So making sure that we've really identified those pieces that are really easy to add in later. We know from our contractor when we can add them in so that it doesn't affect their schedule is really important, and sort of makes me a little bit more positive that, you know, in a year or two, hopefully we'll be able to add all of those things back that we felt like we really had to strip down.
Yeah, what you were saying about lenders and investors scrutiny. Nobody in this room has had a failed project, I'm sure. But the lenders and the funders and the investors, they've seen the failed projects, right? From other parts of the country, I'm sure. But everybody's jittery. Everybody's looking much more deeply at our projects and our assumptions. And like you said, Emily and Allison, you really have to be able to answer those questions in a way that I think is new. From the contractor side, again, at this point where you're trying to start construction, what are you seeing that's new with regard to how long a sub will hold a price? Or like we had a project where the roofer wouldn't even price something until it was on the truck. The materials were so volatile. What do you help your owners do in that regard at the point where you're trying to start?
Well, I'll talk about a couple things. Yeah, for sure. We are seeing, and we have seen over the last, year, really the development of this 10-day pricing model for some subs. It's like, wait, I thought we said 60 days. And, everything from wire shelving to flooring to, a variety of different things, rebar, at the next pricing increase, cabinets. The concrete strike didn't help us in King County, pushed us into a new year of delivery for some things. So it's a great question. I think it's just, again, about being eyes open and above table with a lot of these items, having the conversations early about those things that you want to plan for, control what you can, and prepare for the things that are the unknowns. Try to, get down to what those unknowns are. Try to identify those subs that are not, or those suppliers who are not holding their pricing, and potentially if you're pre-contract, if you're pre-closing, can you get to a place where you can get them to project that escalation as either an allowance or a piece that you can track. We've seen that a couple of times be very effective. Drywall and steel metal framing. We had them on a recent project. They, at bid time, we said, what do you see for pricing? What is it gonna take for you to be able to hold your price? And we got commitment from them very early on. It's somebody that we work with a lot. Kind of worked through the numbers with them, and thus far haven't seen a pricing increase from them at all. So I've got my fingers crossed though.
Yeah, I would say a similar approach. It's caused us to do a lot more study on historic pricing. We use it all the time, but really into deep dives of, roofing material. You mentioned roof insulation. The supplier doesn't send an invoice until that is on the truck because it changes up and down every day, right? So how do I plan for that? Well, I really look at the quarterly price increases for the last 24 months and come up with a reasonable prediction. And we share that with the owner, and we have a plan for it. Like Emily was saying, you have to plan for these things. Some of them are more volatile than others, but it's just causing us to be more prepared. Yeah.
It won't be. I was planned before the hurricane hit
Oh, hurricane. What's that gonna do? Anybody? Any predictions? It's not good. Forest fires, hurricanes, not helping our supply chain issues one bit. Any questions before we move on? Yes.
We aren't doing any work in small communities in Washington, but we do a lot of work in small communities in Montana. And the biggest issue there is labor. As we bring in projects that are at scale, it's very difficult to find plumbers and electricians and subcontractors that can staff, even like a 125 unit project, especially when many of them in the Intermountain West are getting drawn. They get in their camper and they go to Boise and they go to Salt Lake and then go to Denver. And so there's just not adequate labor, even if there is funding for a project. That's been our biggest issue in small communities.
Ditto. That said, you can sometimes find some gems there. We're doing a project in Skagit where we've, found a couple great partners up there, good subcontractors that we wouldn't have found had we not ventured, right?
Great. Okay. So any other thoughts before we kind of move toward our conclusion? Anything you want to add? Any other questions you want to ask? Then we'll have Q&A at the very end. But yeah, Scott. Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge, especially in communities where permitting takes so long, right? And so pretty much you have to commit in jurisdictions like Seattle to pre-planning expenses and design expenses before you have funding, right? That's just life. I'm not sure we're gonna fix that anytime soon. In smaller communities, it's a little less of a problem. In communities where they really want development and are willing to permit quickly. But that does make me think about the funders' role in this process. Maybe we have some thoughts on that, but I just want to do a shout out to funders who are tackling this issue with owners and contractors and architects and recognizing that it is a new world and that gaps are being created between the time you do your cost estimate in September of year 0 and when you do your start of construction at partway into year 2. And so funders are really making an effort to understand that, dig into the problems and solve those issues. But it's a long process. Allison, you want to reflect on that? I know you have a project with a sizable funding gap.
2, 3, everyone. Yeah, so I think we're just agreeing with Brian that all of the funders are really working hard to try to help us solve these gaps. I think one of the pieces, and it's not even just the permitting part, what we're finding on the more complex projects, because Bridge currently has 2 large TOD projects we're working with, it's taking us 2 to 3 years to get to agreement with the jurisdictions regarding the projects. So one project in particularly, or where we got our development agreement signed last December. We're on our trajectory for sort of a roughly 18 to 24 month permitting process. In that period of time, since the first time I got a contractor bid, I've seen 32% increase in construction costs. And that is not for a project that, okay, there's a little bit of scope creep in possibly some items that weren't anticipated from the contractor side, but that really is just what we've seen in the escalation, and frankly, 12% since November. And we're working hard to make sure that we're being cost effective and pulling out what we can. But from the timing standpoint, we've also had to make sure that we've gone back for additional funding, because when those projects were conceived, we thought we were fully funded. And that's really difficult and a little embarrassing when you have to go back. I think the only thing that makes it a little bit better is that it's not just a single project issue. It really is an industry issue at this point.
Yeah, I guess I would echo, we have a similar project that is, well, we started construction and we have not closed our tax credit equity partnership yet. And we are funding the construction out of our own pocket right now because we had to start construction because we couldn't miss the winter weather window and we needed to lock down on pricing. And that's just the reality. I mean, we're a private company, so it's a little bit different than the nonprofits, but it feels to me like tax credit development has never been more risky than it is right now. And that's hard. And you have to, I think even more now, it's important to have relationships at the table. It's important to have team members, both on the development side and on the contractor side, that know what they're doing and that have experience, and that you're working with teams. And into the superintendent question, like, we try to roll our superintendent and project manager forward to our next project, so that like we're not starting the relationship with the superintendent, not just are they getting used to the building and what we've designed, and hopefully they were part of that process, but they know us. They know what our needs are. We have already established how to communicate with each other, and we've already built a level of trust. And I mean, any little space you can grab from the team is really helpful, because it's risky. I mean, the general contractors, like even the ones that get paid for their pre-construction services, you guys are putting a lot on the line to hold space and devote manpower to projects that may not be fully funded yet. So I think recognizing that everyone has a high level of risk, and just devoting the time and resources in terms of your teams to those to best prepare.
You know, I think that's a kind of a good concluding thought, and that is the risk and the complexity are greater than ever. And so that creates a lot of stress on owners, on contractors, on architects, on the whole team, on the funding environment. And so, you know, it's not a happy thought, but let's just recognize it for what it is, and try to all team up on the solutions. And that's something I really appreciate about this industry, is that generally is the approach. Share information, be transparent, work through the problems together. That's the only solution really in this environment. Maybe we'll get back to a normal like it was before, but probably not. It's probably a new normal. Question back here? Yeah, Lisa. So the question is, what do we do about contingency? How much contingency is reasonable? You know, I think we have two ways to answer that question. One, we can increase the contingency significantly, right? Right now, some funders want 5%. Hopefully that's a thing of the past, because that didn't work. But even 10%, we can blow that contingency really easily in this environment, right? So what do? Do you have a 20% contingency? Do you have a 25% contingency? I'm not sure that's the right answer, but if a funder is willing to work with an owner midstream, then I don't think we need a 20% contingency. We just need the understanding that we might have to come back and solve a cost problem partway through a project, or a funder who sees himself as, you know, a gap funder. If the gap ends up being bigger than you thought at the beginning, that commitment might need to be bigger in the end.
Yeah.
Allison?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen is that sort of a little bit of a prescriptive approach on the, at least from the funding application side, is helpful, because otherwise you're trying to compare projects which have vastly different assumptions, which is difficult. So it's almost like there needs to be a little pot over to the side, especially when we're in such a volatile period of time, because at the end of the day, I've done as good as I could to estimate where I would be on the application cycle from last month, but I'm not closing for another year. And unfortunately, if things change for the better or worse, I have no control over that, or not no control, but there are a lot of factors that build into it. I don't know if that's really an answer for you, Lisa, but.
You had another question, Lisa?
Well, I think there are a couple of different ways you could approach it, and I think what we've been trying to push at Walsh, we've been talking about a lot, and I know we've talked a lot about this last night, maybe over a beer, was approaching it in terms of value, right? Thinking about value and thinking about what the owner's program is telling us, what those specifications are telling us, what the requirements are, and really driving. I know some have probably seen our Mike Steffen CEDC approach in terms of cost efficient design and construction, and really baselining design and really baselining our cost estimate, coming up with target value estimates, and saying, we've done this. I know there's lots of unknowns out there, but we know what should go into this project. And really then talking about value, about what wants to be in this project, what the facilities is going to require, what the population, the residents are going to benefit from most. And then, I think we've seen that early integration be extremely beneficial in a variety of different ways, from a mixed, what I would call kind of a mixed design build format, where it's not a fully design build scheme, where we've talked about a little bit, MEP, maybe bring some other subs in to really validate some of those designs as you go. And it's really baselining as much as you can. I know it's not exactly what you asked, but we've seen.
Value engineering is not what it was before.
It is not, yeah. I mean, we could, yeah, exactly. And we could go in and start with solid surface countertops and then take them out. We could go, yeah, it's already done. We could go in and change the finishes and the quality and all that. But, at the end of the day, we should be thinking, especially with affordable housing and these long-term ownership projects, we should be thinking about durability, quality, and starting there and baselining what that means for that project. And then talking about potentially adding value back relative to the other unknowns that are, the project is and may experience.
I was going to just say really quick, we kind of say design to the budget instead of budget the design. So it's just what he's saying is just early on thinking about that versus the slash and burn of finishes.
Okay, we're at the end of our time. So thanks for coming, joining us. I did look at the app and I looked at the questions and I think we covered them, so I'm not going to read those. If you have questions or want to talk to any of the panelists, we'll hang out up here for a little while. But again, thanks for coming. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have the enjoyable rest of your conference. And don't forget to do your evaluations. Have a good one.